Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the sophomore album from Denzel Curry, titled Imperial. You know, if I go back through my hip-hop reviews over the past couple of years, I tend to notice a trend of which I'm certain many of you will probably find exasperating if you've followed me from some time. That even when the flows are good and can connect, if the lyrical content doesn't come through in the same way, I tend to be a fair bit more harsh in the review. A$AP Rocky, The Game, Logic, Future, Drake, you get the general picture. These guys can definitely flow, but if the content gets recycled, doesn't really stand out as much, I don't tend to connect as strongly and don't rate as highly. Hell, even though I like the Flatbush Zombies debut 3001 Laced Odyssey, I'm well aware that without stronger, unique content, I might not come back to that album in the same way. And for once, I know exactly why that is. For one, while I like a good hook, when you hear so much music throughout the course of the year, the hooks really need to have strong melodic backdrop or real punch behind them to really stick with me long term. Same thing with flows. I've heard so many cadences and methods of delivery that only the most distinctive and impressive really stick with me. And yet when it comes to content, it's not just reliant on pure technical craftsmanship to impress me. It taps into a very different part of my focus. Put another way, if you give me a rap song with creative metaphors and really makes me think, I'll probably remember it a lot more than just the next newest banger. Now this takes us to Denzel Curry, a Miami rapper is known for some insane, well-constructed flows and some weird, borderline chiptune inspired hardcore hip-hop production. But always grabbed me was his blend of raw and visceral gangsta storytelling and a reference pool that could dip into some geekier subjects without sounding all that corny. And while I didn't love his debut album Nostalgic 64, I thought it dropped off in quality in the final third despite having some potent tracks all throughout. When I heard that his follow-up this year, Imperial, was going to be even tighter, even more concise, and even more hard-hitting, I prepared myself for an aggressively potent experience. So did I get it? Well, yeah. Definitely got it here. But I also argue this album's a bit of a weird listen when you start thinking about it. Easily more hard-hitting, grimy, and aggressive than anything Denzel Curry has released to date, and yet entirely built on the premise of defying the stereotypes that one would expect from modern hip-hop. It's a record that builds itself on subverting and challenging expectations with the force of a sledgehammer to the face, plowing through contradictions by simply weighing them as infuriating reality, which is an admirable approach, but might push the logic a little bit too far to hold together under deeper scrutiny. And yet, at the same time, it's such a tightly wound and compressed release full of concentrated fury and bites that might just hold together under its own gravitas and personality, blowing through it all with such a speed that it might not even matter. In other words, yeah, this album's kind of great, just deal with it. So let's start off with Denzel Curry himself. And look, I don't think anyone can doubt that he can spit with an impressive level of fury and intensity on multiple fast-paced flows that nearly always show a ferocious investment in his material. And for the most part, this definitely works to his favor. Narcotics, Naughty Head, Gook, ULT, Sick and Tired, Story No Title. When Denzel Curry can get momentum on his side, there's not much that anyone can do to stop him. Even in the last song, where I found some of the lyrical construction to be a tad clumsy, especially early on. And really, for such a tight project, there's little in terms of bad lines or clumsy flows outside of a few flubbed rhymes, and even those there aren't many. And while I was initially skeptical about Denzel Curry handling the majority of the hooks himself, I'm reminded a lot of when Freddie Gibbs handled a lot of hooks on Shadow of a Doubt last year. They've got enough reverb, control the melody, and enough punch behind them to never really come across as corny or overdone. Sure, I didn't really love the hooks on Pure Enough or This Life compared to Narcotics or especially Gook. I really love the hook there, but they really still play to Denzel Curry's strengths in terms of energy and emotive force as a performer. Of course, when you have such a force of personality on record, the guest stars need to step up their game. So while Rick Ross is surprisingly on point with his bars on Naughty Head, it's a significant come down in energy that can't help but slow the song a bit for me. Joey Badass feels a little bit better on Zenith, but I can't help but feel a little bit disappointed here, especially as his bragging doesn't feel nearly as colorful or interesting in the content that as it's been in the past. Even though the production does favor him a lot more than it does Denzel Curry, which is a bit weird. You'd think he'd go up a little bit stronger. And on the topic of production, well, again, I'm of a few minds here, because it's certainly got the sort of aggressive, hard-hitting trap vibe that you would expect, full of grimy bass, eerie, warping synths, and hi-hats that rattle with varying levels of texture and grit. And while by now you've heard so many variants of the sound, you'd probably think an entire record of it might get a little bit stale, but Denzel Curry pivots against that by both keeping this record moving at a very brisk pace and by adding enough weird and alien melodies to keep the listener on their toes. And for the most part, it really clicks. From the oily, glitchy tip tune that plays off the damp guitar tones on Gook to the rubbery bass on Sick and Tired, from the sandy percussion and symphonic hook on Story No Title to the incredibly grimy and brittle synth on Narcotics, with a genuinely menacing vocal layering, the sirens that cut through the mix. Fantastic song. The instrumentation that surprised surprised me the most, though, was on If Tomorrow's Not Here. With the cowbell, the bass melody, the liquid guitar, and the dirty percussion on the hook, it honestly reminded me of a beat that might have shown up on the Marshall Mathers LP from about 15 years ago, and it really does connect for me. Hell, the majority of this production really clicks, with the exception of the backing synth on Naughty Head. Granted, it's not bad. The odd, slightly off-key synth melody reminded me of Arca of all things, and the hook does connect here, but then we get the beat switch up into this wheedling and still off-key synth line against the dirty percussion, and without any verse to really go over it, it feels like an odd moment of instrumental indulgence on this album that feels far too tight to really bother with any such thing. But really, for as on point as the production is, what is Denzel Curry trying to say with this album? Well, initially you might think it'd fall into typical sophomore underground hip-hop territory, ranting about the industry biting your style, blowing rivals and fakers away, the pressures of touring, disconnecting him from his girl or from his hometown. And while all of this does come up in some way, shape, or form, what becomes a lot more interesting is in the details. Because starting off with Gook, Denzel Curry begins setting himself apart. Even if he smokes a bit of weed and carries a gun, he's not a gang-banging goon or a gangsta, making a point on the hook of that song to say he doesn't touch Purr because that's how it killed ASAP Yams. He raging against the stereotypes often leveled as an excuse by the police to get away with murder in the public eye on Narcotics or ULT, and especially on Story No Title, where he describes how rappers who came from money adopt the gangsta persona coming from the ghetto, which only further exacerbates the stereotypes. A track that's like Sick and Tired, following the storytelling tradition as a near sequel of Dark and Violent on Nostalgia 64, shows both sides of that story. Both of them a desperate poor black man sticking up to survive, only to get gunned down by a wealthier gangsta, which doesn't just show Denzel Curry himself swearing revenge for his friend's murder, but to the police it's just another example of black on black crime. It's only exacerbating the situation, making it all that much worse. And yet, Denzel Curry shows that he's not talking down to his audience, as the first verse on Pure Enough shows that exact same pressure to conform, especially if it could bring more success for him in the long run. Although I will say he does lose a bit for me on the second verse with his lines about how girls should dress if they don't want to be treated like escorts. It kind of runs contrary to one of the biggest hidden tricks of this album, one thing I really like, because despite the hyper-aggressive tone of many of these songs, the message is often more complex, and yet if only judged on the surface, could be seen as just more trap bangers. And sure, he's got those, but I did miss the more unique reference pool that he had on previous releases, which thankfully does sneak in most on the extended Star Wars metaphor in If Tomorrow's Not Here, where he muses about the best way to define his own path even while lodged in the broken system symbolized by the prison that the track starts off in, with the most concrete answer to just keep independent in his own unique lane, which is something that only he can really define and control. Not God, not the system. If he keeps it internal and keeps on his own path, he's gonna make it there. So in summary, in terms of independent, hard-hitting hip-hop, I'd probably take Denzel Curry's Imperial over that debut from Flatbush Zombies, but only if by a little. The tighter production, the fascinating contrast messaging, all placed against some of the most ferocious spitting I've heard in a while, and some really strong hooks, and yet it's tough to evaluate whether or not the message's content and tone hold together against a closer look. But then again, when you think about it, Run the Jewels worked a very similar path, and ultimately, I think Imperial will ultimately end up working out. So for me, a light 8 out of 10, definitely recommended if you're looking for some hard-hitting trap hip-hop out of the South that's smarter than many people will give it credit. In other words, definitely managed to check this out. You won't regret it. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Got the poll up here. What did you guys think of the album? Were you as hyped about it as I was? Because seriously, this album's pretty damn great. But beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, or any other albums coming out that you want me to take a look at, I will try to give them a listen. Till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.